Nebraska football had a ton of news coming out of this week. So today we're going to be talking about Big Ten Media Days, the players representing Nebraska in late July. We're also going to be talking about Nebraska football's overall ranking in the NCAA 27 college football game and the 5-for-5 rule that passed on Wednesday. But before we get into the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Coming up on 200 subs, and we appreciate you guys helping us get to that point. But without further ado, we're going to start things off with the Big Ten Media Days, the players that were announced who will be representing Nebraska in Chicago in late July. So really, it's three players. All three are seniors: Andrew Marshall, Justin Evans, and Luke Lindenmeyer will be joining Matt Rhule. And just a quick side note, last year, it was kind of a one-off that happened in Las Vegas. Now it's moving back to Chicago, which is kind of the normal place that things usually go down. But regardless, just giving my thoughts on this, I think it's interesting that Nebraska is kind of moving back to the senior class that's going to be representing it. And then also, we were talking before we hit record and just talking about these three players individually. It's kind of an interesting bunch, like we said. And, it's, in my opinion, they're probably three of the more higher rated, draft prospects that Nebraska has on its roster going into the season as well. So I do like that. I like that Luke Lindenmeyer, is a Nebraska kid, turned himself from a walk-on into, an All Big Ten honorable mention selection. Andrew Marshall was also an honorable mention selection. And then Justin Evans is really viewed as, one of the top interior offensive line prospects going into the draft next year. So all three of these players are, probably, they all started 13 games last season. They'll probably be expected to do the same in 2026. And, they're probably both vocal leaders, not only in their room, but obviously on the team as well. So I think you could be looking at all three of these guys to be potentially, team captains for the season. Nebraska had 6 last year. I'd imagine probably all three of these guys will be, 3 of the 6 if they keep doing that moving forward as well. So, you can go ahead and give your thoughts, but I do like the bunch. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say, in about a month from now.
Yeah, to kind of build off your point, I think it's kind of interesting that, they didn't send, a quarterback in Calandria, where they definitely could have, being a proven college football starter and player, being the Mountain West Offensive Player of the Year for them. And so, I don't know. I do like this approach, though, because, you get to keep going, obviously, besides the jersey announcement, you get to keep kind of going with this quiet offseason. When you have the quarterback there, it kind of just adds like every media person, all fans, they want to hear from the quarterback. It's kind of the face of the program, no matter who it is. And so now you have guys that are, obviously Justin Evans, he didn't allow a sack last year. He's a top 5 interior offensive lineman going into the, potential draft this next year. And then Andrew Marshall was one of our lockdown corners last year. And then, obviously we have Luke Lindenmeyer as well, who was a Big Ten honorable mention. So they're high caliber players that are going to be there for the Huskers, but they're guys that you're like, when you think of Nebraska football, I think of Ja'Cory Barney. I think of, obviously Anthony Calandria, Owen Chambliss, even Williams and Winery. Like, these guys, I'll eventually name them, but like within the first 5, I don't think I would name, maybe these 3, maybe Andrew Marshall potentially, but I just think that, they kind of went with guys that, are high caliber players, and they're probably, leaders on this team, vocal leaders or just leading by example as well. But with guys that are going to go under the radar and, keep, like with what I said, keep with that quiet off season, just kind of just like, Nebraska's going to, put their head down and work. And I like this approach, and I like that they're, going with the seniors, like you said, which is awesome to see. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see not having a quarterback at the Big Ten Media Days. Obviously, we had that 2 years ago, Dylan's freshman year, but it's been interesting just with a proven quarterback on the roster. So.
Yeah, I agree. And we were talking about it again before we were recording, but Nebraska is one of 6 schools in the Big Ten that's not bringing a quarterback. And, kind of famously, Indiana is the only team that's not bringing a skill position player. I want to say that they have a linebacker, an offensive lineman, and a defensive lineman, just going off memory. But I like the idea that when you think of Indiana football last year, you think of not only how old they were, but how physical they were. I mean, just in the national championship, how well they stacked up against Miami, who, has all those high-profile defensive linemen and those pass rushers like Reuben Bain.
Yeah.
And they did, a really, really good job at protecting Fernando Mendoza in that game. So I think Nebraska, if they can take that approach, and they're kind of starting to, like you're seeing Justin Evans there, like you said, you don't think of Justin Evans as like a top 5 player on Nebraska's team, but like here he is, right? And he's gonna hopefully, you know, assuming he continues his trajectory, he's going to turn himself into an NBA or an NFL draft pick in April of next year. So I think, you know, with what Jeep Wade's doing and what he can continue to do, you know, developing a guy like Justin Evans, Elijah Pritchett, and those 3 transfer guys, if we can get, you know, we could be looking at a scenario where Nebraska maybe, you know, potentially has 3 offensive linemen that go into the NFL draft next year, which would be huge for the program, just from a recruiting aspect,
100%.
you know, showing that development of Jeep Wade in his first year. And just, yeah, I guess hopefully that transitions over to the defensive line. But like you said, to your point again, Andrew Marshall, you don't necessarily think of him like that. Although when you really take a step back and look at it, you're like, yeah, he's the best corner on Nebraska's team. And, you know, he was, I think I want to say he was the only defensive back that started all 13 games for Nebraska last year. You know, Sker Wright didn't even start every game, and Sker Wright is he signed with the Bengals, and we know how good he is. So that tells you how trusted Andrew Marshall was in Addison Williams' secondary last year. And then Luke Lindenmeyer, you know, just again pointing it out, he started as a walk-on, and I want to say, you know, he was like the 8th tight end on the roster as an incoming freshman, and now, you know, he's theoretically was the 4th best tight end in the Big Ten last year, and hopefully, you know, he becomes one of the top 3 this year. So. Really like the selection that they made. And just, yeah, again, I think you're kind of seeing players at positions that Nebraska really wants to start developing and is important to start developing and start playing at a high level, you know, just in the conference that they find themselves in. But we'll go ahead and transition to the 5 for 5 here after that. I'm trying to get this picture pulled up. Okay, perfect. So obviously this was probably the biggest news of the week on a national scale. Just knowing all these players are going to get an additional year, and red shirts are kind of going out the window nowadays as well. So I'll let you take it over. And I know you wanted to kind of speak on the recruiting aspects, because obviously this makes roster management a little bit different moving forward.
Yeah. So I'll just touch on the recruiting part and just kind of my thoughts. If you watched our Nebraska basketball video that we just put out, I kind of hinted at I had some thoughts on this. So make sure you go check that out, just if you didn't see that. There's a little bit of some thoughts for basketball wise. But, you know, recruiting, it's kind of interesting because, you know, obviously they have the 105, and, you know, teams are struggling to, you know, be under that 105, and Nebraska's over it with the grandfathered in players. But you just think they're going to take even less players in the high school ranks. You've already seen it with, you know, last year's class being under 15 scholarship guys. And then now this class this year, 27 class, it's going to be a little bit more just because with the volume of high caliber players that are taken in that class and attrition from this senior class and stuff like that. So what I'm trying to get at is, you know, there was guys that didn't redshirt. You had your Ja'Cory Bonnies, you had your Vincent Shavers who didn't, you know, redshirt, and they would graduate after 4 years. Obviously, you have guys that are going to redshirt and they're going to be here for 5 years. But now you almost guarantee that you're going to have almost every single player in your roster be here for 5 years. And hopefully they are only here 3 or 4 years and they get drafted. But that just adds that many more players to your roster. Because, you know, what if Ja'Cory his draft stock doesn't, you know, go up as much and he decides to stay for 5 years? That's a guy that's going to have to stay on your roster, and maybe you say no to an incoming freshman. So it's a new thing that they have to balance. You know, I would hate to be a coach or Pat Stewart right now. There's so many new things. There's NIL, you know, you have your roster limits, and now, oh wait, we have 5 for 5. So everybody is guaranteed 5 years of eligibility. I do really like it though, for the sense of, I think Will touched on it last video. It gives clarity now. You know, I think they're doing away with waivers now. So you can't really, if you got injured, you can't, you know, apply for a waiver to come back for another year. You have 5 years no matter what. So I think that will get rid of the, you know, the 6 or 7, 8 year players in college football, and you'll just have 5 for 5. I obviously feel bad that guys that get injured multiple years and they only get to play maybe 2 out of those 5 years, but I think it just levels the playing field for all these guys. So they'll be here for 5 years. And if you're a really good freshman, you can play as a freshman and not worry about being redshirted, because you'll have 5 years of eligibility no matter what. It's going to take a little bit of adjusting, I think. but I think it will benefit college football, and it is a rare W by the NCAA.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I have a couple thoughts on that, so I'm going to try and not get like lost in the sauce here. But to your point, there's not going to be any more like Javin Wright stories where he played for 7 years, which sucks, right? Because obviously he was a quality player for Nebraska, and injuries, specifically, I guess the blood clots, not necessarily
Yeah.
injuries, but health conditions for him kind of limited what he could do over his career. So that's why he was at Nebraska for so long. So nothing like that is probably ever going to happen again, which, could be good, could be bad, but it's just kind of how things are now. But again, you're talking about a Ja'Cory Barney who now has 3 years left to play should he want them, right? And hopefully those are all at Nebraska, or hopefully he leaves and goes to the NFL and, becomes an NFL draft pick and, becomes like a Tank Dell situation where Dana Holgorsen, turned an undersized wide receiver into a really quality player in the NFL. But I think it's super exciting from that standpoint. I also think, tying it back into the recruiting here in the NIL space, it's going to get super confusing because these players, you're seeing it in basketball last year specifically, how all these older teams did so well and they got to the postseason, and even in football, with Indiana, how old they were. It's obviously those older players are going to be valued, and they're probably going to command a little bit more financial offers in the NIL space as well. But my question to you would be, how do you think Nebraska would go about like high school recruiting? And specifically, I guess, like, we don't know how much like a Trey Taylor is going to get paid, but I'd imagine with this 5-for-5 ruling, kids like that are probably going to be getting paid even less out of high school, knowing that, if you can have Anthony Calandria back next year, he'll have started dang near 45 college games. Like he's, and if he starts for Nebraska again, he'll have 26 games of starting experience at Nebraska, assuming they make it to bowl games 2 years. And he'll have almost 60 games worth of starting experience in college football. And I'd have to imagine that's dang near got to be the record in the history of college football for starts at quarterback. So I guess, just recapping it, what do you think that does to like a high school player from like an NIL standpoint? And also, I guess, just potentially like a roster spot?
Yeah, so I first want to set the record straight so everybody's kind of on the same, wavelength thinking. So, like high school recruiting, if you have a 3-star or a low 4-star, they're probably not going to be a guy who's getting a lot of NIL or NIL at all. And they're going to be a guy that's going to have to work and gain it. So if you get a scholarship, you get a lot of stuff. You get money for meals, you get an iPad, you get MacBook, you get all this stuff for just getting a scholarship. So NIL is crazy on top of that. So it affects high school recruiting, I think, to the effect of maybe right now, let's just say Nebraska, I think, sitting at 22 commits or 21. So if, let's say, the top 10 or 12 guys are getting a decent NIL package and the top 3 or 4 are getting a substantial NIL package, you could probably bump that down to maybe 7 or 8 guys are getting a decent NIL package. Maybe 1 or 2 are only getting a substantial, just because you're having these older players that you're giving more NIL money to convince them to stay on a college roster. Because there's guys that stay on a roster who could definitely go pro and get money. Like, for example, in basketball, Bryce Hanford could have gone pro and got drafted probably in the second round or late in the second round. And so Nebraska had to pay up and give him second round money at the end for basketball. So there's guys that are going to have draft grades at a certain level. Maybe Emmett Johnson could have been one of those guys that, you give him a lot of money and you're like, hey, we need you to come back. We want you to come back. And so you give him money that, maybe a third round draft pick would get, or, he went in the 5th, but maybe it was the 6th. But anyways, just those guys are going to want more money because they maybe have potential of getting drafted, but they have another year of eligibility, to unfinished business, and they want to get paid more. So it's going to affect, high school recruiting. They're just going to be less valued because you'd rather have a guy to the transfer portal that you already know is good, rather than a guy who's you've only seen him play high school ball and he hasn't proven anything on the field yet. So I honestly think that's how it should be. You should pay the guys that have proven they're good instead of pouring in $2-3 million into a high school recruit who hasn't proven anything yet, and you don't know if he's going to be a boom or a bust yet. So that's just my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. And what really sticks out to me with that is just specifically, I was sitting here when you were mentioning, payments and all that good stuff. Like, I'm looking at Brendan Black, and then you're talking about the top couple of guys that are theoretically getting paid very well out of Nebraska's 2027 recruiting class. And I think about a guy like Jordan Agbanoma, who's an interior offensive lineman. That's a top 80 recruit, which you'd have to think he's getting paid very well by Nebraska as a high school recruit. But again, he's not making anywhere near what theoretically Brendan Black, who started over 30 collegiate games, is making, because Nebraska values a player that they've seen in college football more than a player that they haven't. So it's going to be super, and it's not saying that they're not going to take a Jordan Agbanoma in future years in the recruiting class, because obviously he's a great recruit. But I mean, nothing's changing from that standpoint. Even to some extent, I would argue that Anthony Calandra's, absolutely right now currently making more money than Trey Taylor. But who knows when he gets to college what happens. I would still imagine a player like that, I would imagine that, Trey Taylor's commanding a ton of money as the number one quarterback in the country. But, Anthony Calandra is also a really solid quarterback. And he, like we said earlier, he's started 30 plus collegiate games as a quarterback and played well. And he's coming off a Mountain West Offensive Player of the Year, year in 2025. So we'll see what happens. But just from that aspect, I thought it was super interesting when you're talking about the financials, knowing that, a guy like Brendan Black can come back for another year. And, I think Nebraska would be dumb if he didn't, for whatever reason, go to the NFL, to not take him back if they could afford it. But that's also, you're really going to have to balance paying also a Jordan Agbanoma and a Timmy Aliu and a Trey Taylor and a Torrey Pittman and Amir Brown and Corey Hadley and who, you name it. If Ahmad Hudson comes, they got to make money up for that too. So we'll see what happens. But, I like where Nebraska's sitting from an NIL standpoint and a rev sharing standpoint as well. And, Pat Stewart's getting paid a lot of money to figure this stuff out. So I do think that's going to be super interesting. But the last thing that I wanted to talk about that we wanted to hit on here was Nebraska's overall rating in the NCAA College Football 27 game. We're not going to spend probably a ton of time on this, but what I wanted to point out is I think I read something that said Nebraska is ranked 24th overall in the game. And I want to say that was around an Oregon State and a Cal or something like that. It doesn't truly matter, but I guess my question to you would be, we know how good the players on Nebraska's team are or can be. Do you actually think Nebraska has a top 25 roster if they're truly ranked 24th overall from a roster standpoint? And then knowing that, I guess, what are your expectations going into 2024, and how important is it that they meet those versus, kind of underachieving theoretically again for, the last 10 years in a row or whatever?
So, and this is a topic I think, even if before we've done this YouTube, I brought up to friends, family, even on the Instagram. Nebraska has consistently had a top 25 recruiting class. So theoretically, we should be a top 25 team consistently. If you're even if you have a class that's top 25 and a bunch of them are busts, you're probably going to hit on the next year's class and so on and so forth. And since Matt Rhule's been here, besides last year, we've had a top 25 class. And now you can incorporate transfer rankings and high school rankings. And a lot of the sites do it like a composite ranking of, transfer portal and high school. And Nebraska's been top 25. And I think they were close to top 20, top 15 in the transfer portal cycle one year, maybe last year or this year. And so theoretically, if you look at Nebraska's roster, they have a top 25 roster on pure talent. The talent is there. We have a 5-star defensive end in high school. And just for an example of a guy who's high caliber that's on the team. And so we have the guys to go win. Now it's in the coaches' players' hands. Coaches need to develop. They need to scheme up things to help them win and put the players in the best position to win. Coaches can only do so much, obviously. They can coach them up as much as they can, but tell them everything they need to do to get to where they need to be good, and then put up the scheme. And then it's up to the players to go execute that. And so if they can do that, Nebraska can be a top 25 team this year. They definitely have the roster to do it. I think they do. But it's up to the coaches and the players if they're going to have a top 25 caliber season.
I absolutely agree. And just right now, you were talking about Williams Nwaneri, and I'm looking at him on the screen and just thinking Nebraska in the recruiting, under Matt Rhule, after Trey Taylor, he will be the 4th, 5th star that Nebraska signed. It would have been Dylan Raiola in the 24 class, Williams Nwaneri in the 24 class, Danny Odom in the 26 class, and then Trey in the 2027 class. And, you know, if they add an Ahmad Hudson or Torrey Pittman gets bumped back up to a 5-star or something like that, it doesn't really matter. But what I wanted to point out is obviously Nebraska is getting some of the biggest fish out of the recruiting trail in the country. Williams Nwaneri was the 6th overall player in this class. Dylan Raiola was the 7th player in this class. Danny Odom was maybe like the 18th, and Trey Taylor is currently the number 8th on 24/7 Sports. So obviously Nebraska is able to land these kids, and it's more or less just coming down to, can they develop them? I think it's a big year for a Williams Nwaneri to show, you know, hey, he had 2.5 sacks and he led Nebraska's defensive line in sacks last year. Can he get to like 7? Like, can he,
7,
you know, how
yeah.
big of a difference that would be if he can even get to 7? I'm not asking for 12, but if he can get to 7, that changes the whole outlook on Nebraska's defense. And, you know, it's a huge deal. And, you know, even like a Ja'Cory Barney, he's flashed in his first 2 years, but can he have a 800 yards receiving or something like that, you know, and go get 8-9 touchdowns for you in 2026? And, you know, even like a Donovan Jones, who's an in-state kid that you took a chance on theoretically, you know, he's played a lot of football for Nebraska and he's turned out to be a good kid. And to your credit, I know you said at one point, Nebraska is consistently in the top 25 and they're getting all these 4 stars and high rated recruits, and they're going to miss out on some of them. But a lot of these kids are hitting. It's just, can they take the next step, right? So we need to see that in 2026, and I think we will on some of these kids. It's just about how many players on the team can do it at once, and we'll go from there. But just closing thoughts on this: Nebraska is 83 overall. Their offense is 85, which I think is kind of headlined by, I want to say Justin Evans is the highest ranked player on Nebraska's roster, which is awesome to see that their center is that highly rated. I think Anthony Calandria will, I want to say, point out that he was like an 87 overall. These rankings really don't matter too much, but it's fun to see that, you know, at least a couple of these guys are pretty, you know, highly regarded. So we'll see what happens, but I think that'll do it for us in this one. We appreciate you guys tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. We'll try to, you know, get back to you guys on everyone that you guys do, and we'll catch you in the next one.